Hey guys, in today's video, I'm going to share my illustration setup from today and compare it to what I used 5 years ago. I'm going to share my most essential tools, including hardware and software that I rely on every day to do my job, and I'll show you both what I use today and what I used to use back in 2015. I'm also going to show you some illustrations from both periods so you can see how my tools and techniques relate to the actual style I've been working in, or the style that I worked in then versus the style I work in now. So if you're just joining up with me for the first time, my name's Tom Froese and I'm an illustrator and top teacher on Skillshare, where I have helped unlock the world of commercial illustration to tens of thousands of students. So welcome here to all new subscribers and viewers, and of course, welcome back to everyone else. This channel is all about giving you insights and inspiration that will help you become a better illustrator. So I do update very irregularly, but I always want to make sure my content is helpful and in some way inspiring or encouraging to you, whether you're starting out as an illustrator or deep in the trenches like I am. So just a really quick update. I haven't posted a video since my Q&A back in August, but I have been busy. I've spent most of my fall developing my latest Skillshare class, which is called the Style class, and this is where I do my best to break down how I approach developing or finding my illustration style. It was a really hard topic to teach, and it's definitely the most ambitious class that I've produced to date. And yeah, I'm a little nervous about how it's gonna go once it launches, but I am excited. It's gonna launch hopefully in the next 2 weeks. I'm hoping it will be out no later than the middle of December 2020. And of course, I will let you guys know as soon as that launches. But today, I just wanna jump into some practical insights into something I get asked about a lot, which is my illustration setup. So that means my hardware and software tools, the things that I rely on every day to get the job done. So first I'm gonna show you my current setup, and then I'll go back 5 years to look at what I used then, and then I'll compare it to my setup today. So if you like this video, be sure to let me know with the old thumbs up, and if you wanna keep in touch when I post new videos, be sure to hit that subscribe button and that little bell icon to make sure you get notified. You know the deal. Okay, so let's get into it. So first I'm gonna show you my setup from 2020, from today, which I've been using since about early 2017, and that kind of started when I bought my first iPad Pro and Apple Pencil. This was super revolutionary for me and pretty much led to a complete move away from using physical media in my work. So just as a background, I previously used a lot, almost exclusively, for any textures, anything that looked like it was made by hand. I actually did it by hand, and then I would bring that into Photoshop because I really didn't like using digital brushes. I didn't find that they worked for me, and of course, not having a tablet, it was hard to control those in a way that you can with the Apple Pencil. Yeah, just since that time, I've grown really comfortable and confident using almost only digital brushes, and now I've almost very rarely used any sort of scanned in physical media that I used to. And I'll get more into how I worked in 2015. I still think it's relevant. It's still a really fun way of working. But yeah, I think just overall, my work is way more consistent and I'm way more efficient now that I work almost all digitally. I'm also able to take on more kind of complex and intimidating jobs just because digital's so much faster. I know that I can do it and take on just more workload at the same time. So the first essential tool in my toolkit today is, of course, my computer, my iMac, and that includes obviously the peripherals, the keyboard, the mouse, and I mean, obviously, if you're doing any sort of digital part in your process, the computer is going to be at the core of your toolkit. What's new for me this year is that I finally ditched my MacBook Pro and I went with a dedicated desktop. So I opted for the late 2020 iMac because dollar for dollar, it had more power than what I was able to get with any new MacBook Pro. and I just kind of maxed out my options and got a decent amount of RAM. And so I think this will keep me going at least for the next couple years. So the next essential tool, and this one's software, is Photoshop. So Photoshop continues to be my choice for illustration software. I've used it ever since I started illustrating over a decade ago, and it still proves to be more powerful than any other app for the kind of illustration I like to do. So people often ask, why don't I use Illustrator instead? And honestly, I think that may come from the names, actual titles of the programs themselves. So Adobe Illustrator, you'd think would be for all illustrators. It's great if you are a vector illustration, if you want to use only shapes to define your work. Photoshop has the same vector capability as Illustrator, but it also handles raster or pixel-based graphics, which is not native to Adobe Illustrator. So for me, I've always incorporated brush textures and lines and even physical media that I've scanned in, and Photoshop just handles this better than Illustrator. So you might also be wondering, why am I not just using Procreate, since that's kind of like the emerging illustration tool of 2020? And well, I'll talk about how I use Procreate in my process in a bit, but in short, Procreate is just a fraction as powerful as an illustration program as Photoshop, especially for the kind of illustration that I do. Particularly, it lacks vector capability, which I use all the time. And I also like the brushes I use in Photoshop, and I haven't really been able to find anything I'm totally happy with in Procreate. I've even tried importing my Photoshop brushes into Procreate, and it's a total flop at this point. Maybe things will improve in the next few years, but as of today, I have no reason to move my total illustration process over into Procreate. So I have two more points on Photoshop versus Procreate, and then we'll move on to the next tool. So first, I love being able to access Photoshop functions using the keyboard with my left hand as I draw with my tablet with my right hand. Everything is buried in gestures and touch menus in Procreate, which is ultimately slower and disruptive in my flow. I can just, like, without even thinking, almost like a piano player doesn't have to look at the keys. I just do all the keystrokes and I can access all the tools, press V, press B, press number, or whatever I'm doing. I'm not really thinking about it. And meanwhile, I can do all the right-handed stuff as well. And finally, my last point of why I wouldn't use Procreate over Photoshop is I love working on my giant 27-inch Retina screen. As far as I know, there's no way to add a second screen to your iPad while using Procreate. I've tried to do things like AirPlay it onto my TV, but it's super laggy and chunky. So far, I don't know any way of working in Procreate on a big screen. Photoshop is the winner for the kind of illustration I do and just feels the best, and I'm just used to it. So if you're having questions about the software you should use to illustrate, in my upcoming class, the style class, I go into how to choose a digital illustration app based on the kind of analog techniques you want to emulate, because basically all digital illustration platforms emulate some experience of traditional media. So whether it's gouache or printmaking or drawing with a pencil, different software platforms will emulate these media better than others. And I go into that in my class. So of course, again, that class launches in mid-December, so keep an eye out for it. So my next essential tool is digital brushes. And I've noted these separate from the actual software, from Photoshop in my case, because they replace the physical brushes in my older 2015 technique. So I've already touched on how Photoshop allows me to use digital brushes, but I wanted to touch on these as a distinct tool, since as we'll see when I go through my 2015 setup, they replace the actual physical brushes. So when I bought my first iPad Pro and first gen Apple Pencil, I was finally able to start trying my hand at using digital brushes. Well, it's been a long time, or a long road, to finding which brushes work best for me and learning how to use them in a way that doesn't feel kind of defaulty or sort of like a second-rate replacement for physical media. Ultimately, I've become very comfortable in an all digital workflow. So for me, the trick has been finding a way to use digital brushes in a way that's not forcing them to look not digital. Or put another way, I've learned how to use them in a way that doesn't expect them to behave like physical media, which they definitely don't. Instead, I found a handful of brushes that help me achieve the warmth and texture of physical media, but which also look more crisp and contemporary, and importantly, very consistent between jobs. So basically, I've found a way of using brushes that feels natural for what they are. I'm not pretending that they're some kind of gouache brush or something like that. I'm not trying, even though these brushes emulate physical media, which I'm fine with, I'm not trying really hard to make them exactly emulate that in my work. For me, the important thing is that the way I'm using them looks considered. It doesn't look like I just took a digital brush and started using it. So the biggest trick for switching to digital brushes is just like my analog brushes, I've stuck to just a handful or a small selection that includes one broad texture brush, an inker for lines and like little details, a shading brush, and I also have a few pencil-like brushes for certain fine details and just to add a dash of variety in line quality as I need it. Of course, you're probably wondering which brushes I use, so I'll kind of just go through the main ones and they'll give you some sense of what they are. But for broad textures, I use a gouache brush from Kyle Webster's Mary Blair set. And for the inker, I actually use kind of like a fountain pen or a nib pen style brush. And it's actually a customized brush, and it was made so long ago now that I can't remember what it's based on. As for shading, I love using Retro Supply Co.'s Godfather of Grain or Kitchen Sink grainy brushes. And for pencils, I just use a few of Kyle's pencil brushes, including Real Mechanical Pencil HB and Kyle's Drawing Box Pencil 4H. I don't really use these for sketching, but just for adding kind of pencil-like strokes in my actual illustrations. I'll actually describe what I use for sketching in a bit. So if you know me, you know that I hate options, and there are an overwhelming amount of brushes available out there. And the reason I hate options is because they're huge time wasters for indecisive, distractible people like me. So that's one reason I resisted moving away from the inherently limited analog technique I used to use in the first place. Moving to digital for me, like I was afraid that there'd just be too many options and not enough constraints, and I would get lost in that. But somehow I've been able to navigate through the weeds and find a few brushes that work. So are they the best brushes ever? Are they the best solution I could have landed at? Am I certain the ones I use are better than any other possibilities? I actually don't know. But I do know that they work, and they've been working well for me for some time. And for me, that's good enough. Rather than scrolling through a gazillion variations of digital brushes, I can actually move on to actually doing the work. Okay, so the next essential tool is the iPad and Apple Pencil. So getting an iPad Pro and the Apple Pencil was a game changer for me. So back in 2017, I was still using a lot of physical media in my work, but I'd heard good things about using the iPad with Astropad, which, as I'll get into next, allows you to use your iPad Pro as a screen-based graphics tablet for your Mac. At the time, I did have a Wacom tablet, but it didn't have a display on it. So I found that very, very awkward to not be able to see what I was drawing on the surface that I was drawing on. So I use it very rarely. Today, I use my iPad for both sketching and illustrating. And as mentioned, it works great as a screen-based graphics tablet, which is perfect for making finalized illustrations. But for sketching, I actually use Procreate. So Procreate is one of my essential tools, and I'll talk about that more separately in a moment. But getting the iPad changed everything. So suddenly I was able to see what I was drawing as I was drawing on it on the surface, which gave me a lot more control in my work. So nothing else has bridged the digital divide for me. That gap between my drawing ability and being able to make this happen on screen like the iPad Pro. So I hate to admit it, but I don't know what I would do without my iPad and Apple Pencil today. It's become one of the most important tools in my setup, and I think my work would end up back in the Stone Age if I had to give it up. So the next essential tool in my toolkit today is Astropad. So Astropad is a super handy piece of software. It's actually two pieces of software. And of course, by now you know that I use this to connect my iPad to my Mac and use it as a graphics tablet. So it works by having an Astropad app installed on both devices. So one app is on my iPad and the other is on my Mac. And then it magically connects the two, mirroring what's on my Mac display onto my tablet. And then I can use my pencil to draw and select tools and do pretty much anything I can do on my computer using my stylus on my iPad. So there are two versions of Astropad. There's Standard and Studio. So I use Astropad Studio. And the main differences between Standard and Studio are, as you might expect, in features, performance, and pricing. Studio has more customizability and faster performance. It's optimized to meet kind of the demands of professional illustrators. So Standard does almost everything Studio can do, but it has a kind of less customizability and fewer features that may matter to you if you're professional. I actually outline the differences in more depth on my blog, and I'll leave a link in the show notes below. Honestly, I sing Astropad's praises all the time, but I'm doing this totally on my own. They haven't paid me a cent to say any of this. Yeah, I often feel like I'm giving them free advertising, but it's that good of a product. One question I've heard and had myself was about Astropad versus Sidecar, which is Apple's own answer to using the iPad as a separate screen tablet for the Mac. In fact, I was kind of hoping that it would mean that I didn't have to subscribe to Astropad any longer, as much as I love them. So when I got my new Mac this fall, I was finally able to try it out, and I'm disappointed to say it actually doesn't work well at all. As a second display, it of course works seamlessly because it's Apple products with Apple products using Apple software. But as a tablet for using Photoshop with, it's not at all responsive to pen pressure. So in the few minutes I spent with it, I couldn't find any settings that would help me adjust tilt and pressure sensitivity, which renders it totally useless for the way I need it to work. So for now, I continue to use and recommend Astropad for anyone who wants to use their iPad as a tablet for working in Photoshop. Okay, so the next essential tool in my toolkit is Procreate. So I've mentioned Procreate a lot already, and I've even explained how I don't use it for my actual illustrations, but I do use it almost exclusively for sketching, exclusive to, like, say, drawing on paper or anything like that. As we'll see in my old 2015 era setup, I used to do all my sketching with pencils on paper. Again, I'll describe my old process more fully in a bit, but let's just say that Procreate has greatly simplified my sketching process. You might wonder why I wouldn't just sketch directly in Photoshop, especially given all the pencil brushes out there. But the number one reason for choosing Procreate instead is because of the pencil brush in Procreate itself. Where it comes to looking and feeling like a natural pencil, nothing comes even close to Procreate's selection of built-in pencil brushes. I use the HB and 6B brushes, and they are buttery smooth. They have nice variation and respond very well to pressure and tilt. I've tried sketching directly in Photoshop, and with all the menus and additional functionality, I just find the experience clunky for sketching, which I think should be a very simple and unfussy experience. So as for how it compares to my older process of drawing just by hand, when sketching, I often have to iterate or trace over my sketches until I get them right. So back in the old days, I would have to get a new sheet of paper and use a light table and trace it over. In Procreate, I can just trace over sketches on new layers in the same document. When I'm done sketching and I want to start illustrating over them in Photoshop, Procreate allows me to export the file to a Photoshop document and send it to my Mac via AirDrop. So it's very seamless. Just one final thing about sketching in Procreate. When I'm working on an illustration in Photoshop, but I need to change my sketch a bit, like I find that the sketch that I'm illustrating from is missing something and I need to go back to the sketch, I can actually go to Procreate, make the change, copy it to the clipboard, and it magically ends up on my clipboard on my Mac by way of handoff. So basically, anything that I copy and put to the clipboard on one of my Apple devices becomes available to all the other devices that are powered on and on the network. So that's kind of cool. I know Procreate's a powerful app for illustrating in its own right, but so far it lacks the power and functionality that I love in Photoshop. And so right now it's just doing a lovely job of being my glorified sketchbook, but it works beautifully. And again, I feel like I'd go back to the Stone Age if I didn't have it. So those are my most essential illustration tools today in 2020. That's my iMac, Photoshop, my digital brushes, my iPad and pencil, and Astropad to use my iPad as a tablet, and lastly, Procreate on the iPad for sketching. So now I'm gonna share with you guys my old setup from about 5 or so years ago. Stick around after that though, because we're gonna look at some work I've made in both setups side by side to see the effect these tools and techniques have had on my style. So before we move into the second part, I'd just like to remind you that I made this video for you as a free resource. If you got anything at all out of this, please be sure to give it a like. This is the best way to let me know you're into my content, and of course, it really fuels me up to make more. And if you do like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. Okay, let's get on to the old illustration setup. So 2015 was sort of the golden era of what I would call my inky style or technique, where half my technique involved physical media. I prided myself on how I used physical media versus digital brushes, which I felt were somehow an artistic compromise. Now, of course, I don't feel that way today, but I just felt like I couldn't get the soul and character that I wanted in my work with digital tools, and it was the inky physical media that I was using that gave my work its soul. I feel like for me, in my journey, culminated in my first Skillshare class. So it kind of came together and I defined it. I first gave it a name, Inky Illustrations, when I made my first ever Skillshare class, which, no surprise, is called Inky Illustrations. So I'm pleased to say that actually today it's still quite a popular class, and a lot of people just really enjoy the techniques, and what's good about it is you're doing digital illustration, but you're using your hands a lot and getting ink on your hands and getting messy too. So there's this nice combination of chaos and order, and I'll actually get into that very concept in a second. The advantage of the style, of course, like I said, is that it's really fun to work with and very accessible to illustrators of every ability. The downside of my old technique, which ultimately pushed me to digital, was the time it took to get things right and how limiting it was for more complex illustrations, especially scenes and things like detailed maps. So I'm talking about my process a lot here, but really I'm here today to talk about the tools that I use, and in this case, the tools that were essential to me when I was doing my inky style in 2015. And of course, the first most essential tool was my computer, my MacBook. So even though my older style involved more analog elements, it was still ultimately digital illustration coming together in Photoshop. All the way up until about 2 weeks ago, I'd always used a MacBook Pro, and that started way back in art school in 2008. Since I started illustration professionally, I've always had a separate Thunderbolt display, which of course makes illustrating so much more enjoyable. It's nice to see your work up on a large screen. My main reason for having the laptop, of course, was always to have portability. For most of my career, I've had to keep things mobile, especially when I had an offsite studio. Being able to take my work home with me meant I could avoid late nights in the studio and work from the comfort of home. All my vector shapes were made using a mouse. There's actually nothing quite like a mouse for precision and control when making vector shapes with the pen tool, whether you're working in Photoshop or Illustrator. Back in 2015, as mentioned, I had a Wacom tablet, which was disappointing where it came to making freehand marks, but it was especially difficult to make clean vector paths with. It was ultimately a useless piece of equipment for me in the way I worked. The mouse, aside from my MacBook Pro, was my main piece of illustration hardware. I couldn't have done much without it. The next essential tool in my 2015 setup was Photoshop. So for software, nothing has changed between 2015 and today. I still use Photoshop and I still believe it's the best app for the kind of illustration I do. I'd say I use it mostly in the same way as I ever have, in the way that I build up my illustrations on layers using both vector and raster elements. The most significant difference is, of course, in how I add raster or pixel-based textures and lines to my work. While I now use digital brushes, I used to create these elements with physical media, and that brings me to the next essential tool in my 2015 toolkit, which was, or it's kind of a group of tools, ink, pens, and brushes, and you could include paper in that as well. So the biggest difference between my technique now and in 2015 is in how I used analog or physical media for most of my textures, lines, and marks in my illustrations. While I would create the base illustration in Photoshop, adding colors and shapes, it was the physical textures and lines that really brought my illustrations to life, giving them their vitality. I would use various brushes or mark making techniques such as rollers with black ink on paper. Then once dry, I would scan these marks in with my flatbed scanner. Just like in my digital techniques today, I had a limited set of brushes and other tools that I would use for specific types of marks. So broad brayer or ink roller with printmaking ink for broad textures, wide flat brushes for broad strokes and some lettering, and thin round tapered brushes for smaller details. My main inking tool, however, was my nib pen, which I used to make most of my thin strokes as well as my go-to whimsical hand lettering style at the time. Other than that, anytime I needed some kind of other texture, I would spend some time experimenting with various textures or tools like using damaged brushes or crayon rubbings or that kind of thing. Just like really being experimental and seeing what made what texture and see what worked. Mostly, however, in the interest of limiting my options and staying efficient, I stuck to the above mentioned tools and just tried to use them as creatively as possible. So the next essential tool or set of tools that I used in 2015 was my pencil and paper for sketching. Of course, without a proper graphics tablet, I had to do my sketching with a good old pencil and paper. I was really not that fancy about it. I would just buy cheap printer paper and use whatever pencil I happened to have floating around, whatever I could reach from where I was sitting. So anyone who watches my Skillshare classes knows about how iterative my sketching process is. I'll draw a rough sketch to start and then trace over it until I refine it to the point where everything is clear and resolved. While this is very easy using layers in Procreate, it was somewhat cumbersome using paper, literally tracing over on a new sheet of paper each time, and of course, always having my eraser handy. For tracing, I actually had a light table, which became quite indispensable to my process. So I would tape a sketch to the light table and then tape a sheet over top and trace. I would do this over and over again until I had a sketch I was happy with. Then I would scan in my sketch on the flatbed scanner, and this became a bit of a task when it came to having multiple sketches to bring onto my computer. So to this day, I have piles of sketches from those days, although I've had to discard a lot of them because I accumulate so many pages of sketches over the years. It's just like, what am I going to do with them all? So today I like that my sketches are now digital and I can access them quite easily, and like there's room enough for them all. Like they're just digital files, and I don't have to throw them out, which I always feel a little bit bad about. So at least if they're on the computer, they exist somewhere. So the next essential tool at the time, 5 years ago, was my scanner to bring everything in, including my sketches, which I've mentioned, but also all the textures and stuff like that. So one of the most important links in my flow was my flatbed scanner. It was essential in getting those sketches and my inky marks from the real world into digital form. Now, while there are other options for digitizing physical work, for instance, you can just scan your drawings using your iPhone, only a proper dedicated scanner will pick up all those subtleties in a brush stroke or an inky texture. If you've ever taken any of my inky classes on Skillshare, particularly inky illustrations and inky maps, you'll be familiar with my alpha channels technique for properly sampling digital textures in Photoshop. In short, my alpha channel technique allows me to bring any mark made with black ink on paper into Photoshop without having any of the white background in it. And that kind of preserves a lot of the subtleties and nuances of those, whether it's a pencil stroke or a washy ink. The scanner really picks that up nicely, and the alpha channel preserves that. So with even the simplest of illustrations, I'd often have to do multiple pages of marks and textures and then scan each page in and then cut and paste them into Photoshop using alpha channels. And I would have to do this for each one. For a larger and more complex job, this became really cumbersome and clunky. And I am so glad I don't have to do this anymore for most of my work. The greatest payoff for using physical media really was in the handmade, spontaneous character they have. If you were to look closely, there's really no comparison between physical media and attempts to emulate these digitally. Also, for some, working in an analog technique is simply a joy. Like piecing things together digitally can really be part of the fun of illustration. And if you're not doing that, if everything's just on the screen, that could really be a joy killer for a lot of people. For me, the greatest joy was in seeing how things came together in a final illustration, almost in spite of myself. So I'd make all these textures and stuff and not really know how it was going to turn out. And I actually kind of enjoyed that if I wasn't under a lot of pressure. And that was a huge part of the process that I was afraid I would lose when I moved to all digital. So this idea of like making a bunch of stuff and putting it together in Photoshop, I often describe this as combining chaos and order. I'd make chaotic, less controlled marks in physical media, and then I'd use the digital tools, particularly Photoshop, to bring some sense of order to them. The combination of these two contrasting elements, chaos and order, created a very satisfying result. Now, I've already mentioned this, but I think it deserves being an essential tool in my list of tools from 2015, and that's my light table. So again, the light table was an essential tool for me, especially in iterating sketches and having some way of matching up marks I would make in ink to the shapes and forms I drew in my sketches. So basically, if I needed to have a line that followed a certain contour that I had sketched, I could take that sketch, put it on the light table, put another piece of paper on it that I was going to ink, and then I could trace that contour in ink. So at a certain point, I was lucky enough to find a giant industrial looking light table on Craigslist. But before that, I would sometimes use a window, which is great for a pencil, but awful if you're inking because the ink will drip. But more often I'd use sort of a carbon copy technique where I filled an entire side of a sheet of paper with dark pencil, and then I used this as duplicating paper. Basically, for any areas that where I needed to ink a precise line that would match up perfectly with a contour of my illustration, I'd have to place the carbon paper between, this is like this duplicating paper that I made, between a new sheet of paper below and my original sketch above, and then trace the sketch using a pencil, pushing down with enough pressure to transfer some of the pencil shading of the middle sheet down on the bottom sheet. If this sounds super complicated, it kind of was. Ultimately, I needed some way to duplicate sketches and line my inky marks up with my sketches, and my carbon copy technique worked best. But then ultimately the light table made tracing way easier. It was super complicated, and basically the light table saved me many steps. The light table was to my inky illustration technique what the iPad became to my overall technique. So it was a huge game changer. So if you're working in an inky style, if you use a lot of physical media and then you're scanning it in and you're not using an Apple or an iPad and a pencil, having a light table is a pretty useful piece of equipment. So those were my essential tools around 5 years ago. A MacBook, Photoshop, pencils, ink, brushes, and paper, and a light table for tracing, and of course a scanner to bring all those physically made elements into Photoshop. Once I had my setup, it was really inexpensive to operate and maintain. The only thing I had to buy was the occasional art supplies, namely paper, brushes, and ink, which really doesn't even come close to the expense of operating and maintaining hardware and keeping these up to date. There's no subscription fee for the physical tools, and the only digital subscription I needed at the time was Creative Cloud for Photoshop. Today, I'm on to my second iPad Pro and Pencil, plus I'm servicing 2 tool-based subscriptions, Astropad and Creative Cloud. All that to say, the efficiencies and newfangled abilities that come with all the tech definitely come at a cost. I can justify these, of course, because they are the tools of my trade, and all things considered, it's still pretty low overhead compared to a lot of other trades. So as promised, I wanted to do a quick side-by-side comparison of a few illustrations just to show you how these techniques have affected my actual style, like how my illustrations actually look as the result of the change in setup. There are so many examples of work in both my old techniques and my new ones, so I thought it would be good to break some examples down into 3 categories. Let's call them inky, purely digital, and then the in-between, which we'll call transitional. Examples of my inky style are where I've used only physical media to create the textures, line work, and marks that go over the basic shapes and colors in the illustration. In purely digital, on the other hand, I show examples where I haven't used any physical media. Finally, in my transitional examples, I show this sort of in-between stage as I'm building up to a more digital-only technique, but I'm still leaning partly on physical media. So just the other day, someone asked me if I miss working in my analog techniques, and I said an affirmative no. While there are elements I miss about working in all analog, especially the joy of exploring with different ways of making marks and messes in the process, I don't miss the uncertainty or the lack of control, which for my commercial work has become a priority. I like to balance artistic integrity with reliability and practicality, and what I have today outshines what I used to have in that regard. I can do more consistently, faster. So here's my first example under the 2015 inky style, my tools of the trade postcard. As you can see, there are solid shapes that are clearly made digitally using the pen tool, and then I've added to them various textures that I made using scanned in physical media. My inky style was strongly rooted in letterpress printing techniques, which depends on very limited color palettes, solid shapes, and more delicate line work details. A lot of the character of the work would end up coming through in the final print rather than in the pre-press artwork. When my work was not literally destined for letterpress, I would emulate this look using sampled print-based textures, which would help soften up those large areas of solid color and give them more life. This is one of the first illustrated maps I ever did way back in 2015. Again, I used only physical media for the textures, hand lettering, and fine details. The rest, including the shapes, roads, and of course the font used for the street names, were created digitally. When I look at this map, I see a lot of whimsy and soul, but I also see how I struggled with the finer details, particularly in these tiny icons. Because I had to line up marks I made separately by hand with the shapes made in Photoshop, there was always a bit of guesswork and imprecision. I think the strength of this style was in the looseness and spontaneity. The weakness I'm pointing out, the lack of precision, was also its strength. Now I want to take a look at some more work I've made more recently with purely digital techniques. Here's a spread from a book that will be coming out in January 2021 called The Castle the King Built. You can see how much detail is involved here in the costumes, the faces, the hair, and of course the festal spread on the table. Developing artwork with this much detail, especially an entire picture book full of them, using my inky techniques, would have been an insane accomplishment. Under it all, however, you can see that I still use the same basic elements, shapes made using the pen tool, and then textures and details using raster-based elements. The difference is that I now make these directly in Photoshop using digital brushes and my Astropad setup. I don't think anything underlines the difference between my 2015 and 2020 tools and techniques more than in my maps. Recalling the Washington, D.C. map done in my purely inky style, you can see how much more confident and refined my illustrations and even the base map are in this one made for Porter Airlines in-flight magazine just about a year ago. While I think you can see some vestiges of my old techniques and just my overall quirky way of representing things, there are more details which are laid down with more precision over top their underlying shapes. There's also more cohesiveness. Whereas in the 2015 style, I feel like the inky textures and lines sort of sat over top the digitally made elements. In my 2020 style, the shapes and details are inseparable. I think also, due to having more control with my Apple Pencil, I'm now also able to make shapes that are more precise and confident. Now turning to my transitional period starting around 2017 and leading right into 2019, this is some work that I did for a major project that ended up in various formats including brochures, maps, and even up large on walls. This particular project came together in 2018. At this time, I was becoming more comfortable using my iPad, but I still felt that it was important to maintain some physical textures as part of my style. Even to this day, using my digital brushes, I can't get the same look I was able to achieve here. So in this period, I was really just working out how to maintain a warm, non-digital look in the majority of my textures and details. Meanwhile, you can also see that I started trying to bring in some digital details, sort of sneaking them in where they could kind of inconspicuously coexist with the more dominant physically sourced bits. These maps made in 2017 were for GQ France. I had to make multiple maps of various ski slopes throughout the world with a lot of details and all within a very short period, perhaps 2 weeks from start to finish. I had to work fast. It was in this pressure cooker situation that I was forced, in spite of myself, to use digital brushes as my main method of adding texture and details. I realized that holding on too dearly to my identity as an inky illustrator was holding me back from taking on more complex jobs. I realized that digital brushes needed to be used for what they are, not what they aren't or what I wish they were. Still, in these maps, I was still very much all about using inky techniques for the lettering. I think it created a nice contrast, and to this day, I still turn to physical media for lettering, although now I'm very comfortable doing all my lettering using completely digital techniques. When I look at these examples of my work, I see mostly a progression toward more confidence and consistency in my style. I think my work is stronger, but I'm curious about what you guys think. When you look at my older analog work and my newer all digital work, which do you prefer? Like what do you think I sacrificed or gained between the two? And of course, what are your favorite tools and techniques? What does your current illustration setup look like? Let us know in the comments. I'd be curious to see what you're finding most works these days. So I've shown you my current illustration tools and compared those to what I used 5 years ago, and then I've shown you how these setups have influenced my actual style. I don't usually get into showing my actual techniques or work in my YouTube videos, but I'm excited to share a bit of this because it's come up as a request quite a few times. I hope you like it. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you do. Thank you for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next video. And of course, stay tuned for my imminent announcement of my next Skillshare class, the Style class. And I'll be blasting that out here on YouTube and of course on Instagram. You can follow me there at Mr. Tom Froze. Until then, keep making great work and keep asking great questions, and I'll see you in the next video.